Alice sat in the cafe and watched in amazement as Andrew walked in and approached her table. Andrew and his wife, Louise, had been Alice and her husband's neighbors for almost 4 years. They were a little older than her, in their late 30s rather than early 40s, but they had become very close to Calvin and to her. They had even gone on a few vacations together a few times, with and without the kids. "Andrew, what a surprise," Alice said a little nervously as she looked around the door. "Aren't you supposed to be at work?" "I can tell you the same thing," he replied calmly, sitting down across from her. "I took the day off to take time for myself, and I assume you did the same?" Alice nodded. "It was a busy morning, and I needed a little recuperation, that's all. I never knew you liked coffee shops like that." "You're right, I don't," Andrew said, looking her in the eye, but she continued to avert her gaze. "To be honest, I saw you come in here and decided to join you. We need to talk." "Is something wrong?" Alice asked. "Nothing with Louise, I hope." Andrew lowered his eyes for a moment and smiled at her. "No, everything's fine. Thank you for your concern. You and Calvin have become very important to us, and we know we can count on you if anything happens to either of us. I wouldn't hesitate to do the same. That's why I had to come here." "Why?" "I'm fine. Just a little tense," Alice said. "You've already made love to him?" interrupted Andrew in a quiet, lowered voice. "What?" Alice's face reddened. "I don't know who—" "The guy who keeps making you stare at the door," said Andrew. "Really? Did you have an affair with him or not?" "No, it's not like that," Alice said. Her face flushed and her hands clenched convulsively. Andrew closed his eyes and smiled, shaking his head, then opened them and touched her hand gently like a father. "I'm going to tell you what's going on, what you might think is going on, and finally, what he thinks. It's very important." Alice only nodded. "He's charming, either younger or more successful than Calvin. He seems to have some qualities that are better than your husband and let you pour your heart out to him. He also compliments you in many ways. When you needed someone, he was there for you and at some point sacrificed something for it." Alice felt her body tense up. "How do you know?" "He suspects. Of course he suspects," Andrew said, "and you know he does without proof. I'm sure you've made him feel like an idiot for his suspicions." "How do I know?" "Here's what happened. There were 2 important events in the last 2 weeks, and you missed both for 2 different reasons. Something happened to Mr. Charmian, and he needed you as a friend. And because you considered yourself indebted to him, you skipped your son's birthday and your 9th wedding anniversary dinner to be with him." "Nothing happened. We're friends." "This friend wants to know everything about your husband, and you told him, even intimate details you probably wouldn't share with me. No matter what you tell him, he backs you up and pretends it's all Calvin's fault, whatever your problems are. I bet he even uses Calvin's suspicions as proof of what a terrible husband he is. Did you miss a party or dinner with your husband when he kissed you and confessed his attraction to you?" Alice's mouth twisted. "How did you— when?" She lowered her gaze and her hand trembled slightly. "When I missed our anniversary. He was depressed because an old friend died. It just happened. But I stopped him before—" Andrew nodded. "So that's a fair interpretation of what happened. Because of your defensive stance and the fact that you're now sitting here waiting, I think it went a little further than a kiss. Not love, but far enough that, if you caught Calvin doing the same thing, you'd consider it cheating. However, you think it's Calvin's fault for not being the husband you want, like Mr. He's just a friend giving you what you think you're not getting at home. Although you're drawn to him, and the attention is a bit of a turn-on, you won't cross the line. You've probably already told yourself that you haven't crossed it, but a big part of you already feels guilty and hopes Calvin never finds out." "Are you going to tell him?" Alice said. "So you admit I'm right so far?" said Andrew. I admit to guessing your feelings. Actions are easier to predict. We slept together, but I couldn't follow through, said Alice, her eyes watering. He understood and just held me while we slept. We did some things, but we didn't take our clothes off. Mostly. Calvin is so stupid, and I was angry and drunk. And you proved him right, Andrew said. No, I won't tell Calvin any of this, but he'll find out anyway. Okay, here's what he thinks. Mr. Charming sees an attractive woman being kidnapped. He sees vulnerabilities he can manipulate. He doesn't, Alice began, but Andrew stopped her with a calm gesture of his hand. Mr. Charmian knows that because he has experience. Pardon the unfortunate cliché, but this isn't his first rodeo. You see, you think you're his target. You're not stupid enough not to know that he's wanted to sleep with you from the moment you started dating him behind your husband's back. Mr. Charmian has made you think that there is something special between you and he provides what your husband lacks. Mr. Charmian takes pleasure in knowing that he has taken something away from Calvin, so he convinces you to skip two very important events to show that he means more than Calvin. It's no coincidence that the boyfriend's death and another crisis happened at exactly the right time for you to miss both events. Calvin's birthdays are in 3 weeks. Something will happen that will make you miss all the plans you have, because it's all about Calvin. He's not... Andrew raised an eyebrow. You were in the arms of a charmer while your husband waited at a restaurant for an hour before you finally texted him to get up, with a girlfriend at work who got food poisoning. You didn't even have the ingenuity to give a name, probably so Calvin wouldn't look into it. Now you're waiting for Mr. Charming, skipping work. You've shown your current priorities. This is definitely not your marriage. He wants me, Alice said. That's all. He doesn't want Calvin to know as much as I do. He doesn't even know my husband. Mr. Charmian knows full well that Calvin has every reason to be suspicious, and that he can convince you that this is an overreaction. He needs that suspicion, that wedge between you. Otherwise, we have no chance of making a deal. Because here's the deal. And listen carefully. I said it's about Calvin, not you. Mr. Charming thinks he's going to get everything he can from you. And then, when he realizes he's completely stolen you from Calvin and you from him, he'll reveal his ultimate goal. Make sure your loving husband knows everything, and then he can continue the physical relationship for a while, at least until he finds his next trophy. How do you know that, Louise? Andrew smiled. My wife and I have been faithful spouses for many years, but I haven't always been married. You have 2 choices. Continue this affair because you know it is, and try to prove me wrong that it won't end in love, or stay secret because Charmian isn't who I think he is. Or end it and have hope of saving my marriage. When Charmian gets everything he's going to get, he'll make sure Calvin knows about it. Maybe even lie about getting more than he got. Alice began to cry. Please, I can't. Calvin can never find out. Andrew walked over to her, hugged her comfortingly, and whispered in her ear. Nothing. Not even a kiss on the cheek without your husband knowing. Otherwise, I'll make sure he finds out. Alice, is that man bothering you? Came a voice from behind them. Andrew turned and saw a young man, tall and thin, with a huge beard. Andrew held out his hand for a handshake, and the man slowly did the same, grabbed Reed's hand and squeezed it hard. Andrew pulled him to him and, bending his finger, whispered in his ear, Listen to me, you scumbag. You're going to make a scene, and that finger is going to be broken. You won't talk to my wife. You won't talk about my wife, or I'll have you whipped. You're not her husband, Reed said with pain in his voice. Who are you? Wrong. But as far as you're concerned, I am. This is just between you and me. I'm the only one you talk to about this, otherwise, you run your fingers partially into the cookie jar but don't risk losing your hand. She's not worth it, is she?
Oh, no, definitely not, Reed said, rubbing his hand after Andrew let go of it. Fucking waste of time. After 2 months, hardly anything is going to work with that frigid broad.
Alice was sure Reed hadn't expected the punch, and while everyone watched in silence, Andrew stood with his hands up as Reed picked himself up off the floor and hurried out the door. "Self-defense, guys. That man was bullying my sister, and you saw how aggressive he got when I told him to stop." A murmur of agreement was heard, and everyone went back to their business. Andrew turned and said to Alice, "You have a second chance. Go home, be the wife your husband deserves. I know it will be hard, but tell him he was right to suspect, but you stopped before it was too late. Don't mention that I had to intervene. It's best for you. I know Calvin. He'll be angry, but he'll want to put this behind him." "Thank you," Alice said, wiping her eyes. "I didn't do it for you," Andrew said. "I did it for Calvin and to make a little atonement for past actions. Have a good day. Subscribe to our channel to keep your partner from cheating on you, and listen to the next story because this story is nothing compared to the next."